Thank you everybody for attending. My name is Jimmy van der Zwaan. I'm a tax partner with Taxand in Amsterdam. So it's a home match for us. We had a very beautiful boat trip yesterday evening, which I hope you all enjoyed. And we are very glad that the city of Amsterdam organized our side event in the Amsterdam Light Festival, which we could join. But it's now back to business and back to transfer pricing. And it might look to be a far shot to go from Amsterdam Light Festival to arm's length, but it's it's closer than you think, because we transfer prices. We try to achieve reasonable pricing and overcome emotion. And there was a pricing issue during last year's Amsterdam Light Festival, because the city of Amsterdam asked the artist, respected artist Ai Weiwei, he's a Chinese man, to make an artwork, and he produced a thin line, which you can see on the picture. It's the red thin line. It was a 6.5 kilometer long glass fiber producing a red light. But there was one difficulty. They had to install electricity sockets every 50 meters. So there were quite a lot of people living in Amsterdam that felt that the artwork was too expensive. And that's about the discussion we can have with the tax authorities. Either you find it too cheap or too expensive. And of course, I'm not going to compare the tax authorities with the art lovers in this room. But so that's what we do. We try to build reasonable pricing to overcome emotion. Transfer pricing is not an exact science. So there's a logical link. I had to think about it, but there's a logical link between the Amsterdam Light Festival and what we are going to do today, transfer pricing. But now back to the program. I think we have a nice program, and I already in advance thank the Dutch tax authorities and Marlen Sáenz from the OECD for participating. We've got some great panels, so I hope that you enjoy the day and find it good content. I will be hosting today with Marlen Sáenz, our service line leader based in the US. If you have any questions, let us know and we'll be able to assist. Marlen Sáenz, if you may ask you to join. Marlen has been working with the big four firms as well in Latin America and in Switzerland. She's now working with the OECD on transfer pricing, hard-to-value intangibles, all topics that we will be discussing today. May I hand over the microphone to... Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Well, thank you all. Good morning. I hope you had a good breakfast, that you're rested. I'm really happy to be here because from the OECD point of view, the only thing that you actually see is the result of our work. And maybe you may think that we work at a very slow pace and that maybe the guidelines that we produce are not that practical or simple or complete. But the truth is that the work that's been done in the OECD, now that you have to consider that it's not only OECD members who have to decide on the content of the TP guidelines, but also the members of the inclusive framework, it's a difficult task to make sure that at least around 50 countries, which currently participate in the WP6 meetings, agree on the text, on the content, on the implications of the work that we do. So it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to be in front of you and explain a little bit of that. And of course, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them. So the agenda of today, what I'm going to talk about today is basically what is it that we've been doing for the last, let's say, 2 years, where the documents are, whether they're finished or whether they're still unfinished business. The first topics that I will comment on is the BEPS follow-up work. As you know, even though we completed the BEPS work, there were still a few issues that remained to be addressed. And for that matter, we continue the work based on this mandate. We will go briefly through these different work streams. We'll start with the additional guidance on profit attributions to PEs. We'll also go a little bit on the revised guidance on profit splits, the hard-to-value intangibles section, and the guidance on financial transactions. Later on, I will also discuss what is coming next. So we will also be dealing with Chapter 4 and Chapter 7, revised guidance. And we also have other projects that are not BEPS-related projects, but that the Secretariat and WP6 are currently starting to work on. This is a dialogue with certain jurisdictions. Maybe you have heard that we're closely working with Receita Federal in Brazil, not only for the accession process, but mainly it was driven because of that. We had also a new mandate from the G20 to start working on an agenda on tax certainty within WP6. And finally, I will touch upon briefly on what is actually happening as we speak. Yesterday and today in Paris, in the conference center, we have reunited WP6 and WP10 delegates, and they are starting to work on the review process of the CBCR. This is something that will happen in the 2020, but we are starting as of now to come up with the agenda and which will be the topics that will be further covered by these two working parties. Okay, so let's start with the easy part. Profit attributions to PEs. I suppose that you're well aware that after Action 7 was issued, that ended up with a new definition or a higher threshold for PEs. And because of that, and also because of the work that we did within Actions 8 to 10 on transfer pricing, we had a further mandate to revise whether the rules that we usually used to apply to the profit attributions to PEs still remained, or if there was a need to come up with new ways to do this attribution. We worked on that, and to tell the truth is that in 2016, in November, we had already produced a first draft that went out for public consultation. We received the comments, and right after the WP6 meeting finalized in November, we decided to actually start all over again. So from all the work that was done, we realized that that guidance didn't really complete what we were being asking to do, and we started from scratch all over again. We started actually literally with a blank page, making sure that what should be included in this guidance and what would be of relevance for the companies within this new guidance. We worked on that again, and this time we succeeded because we were able in March, I think, yes, in March, to issue this report, which concludes, maybe the conclusions weren't as exciting as we would have expected. Many countries out there, because of Action 7 and the new thresholds for PEs, were thinking, maybe with these new thresholds, we will be able to get a little bit more of a tax base. But within the profit attribution, let's say, work, we realized that actually nothing has really changed, and that this profit attribution still needs to be done within Article 7 and Article 9. The rules haven't really changed. That's a very important message. And also the fact that depending on the tax treaty and the Article 7 on that tax treaty, you would either apply either the AOA approach or whatever other approach you may have within that tax treaty. Of course, an important message was to make sure that you prevent double taxation, and that there was, and that we allowed for some administrative measures to reduce the compliance and administrative burden. Now, on the revised guidance on profit split. This was a mandate from Actions 8 to 10 final report. We needed to clarify when this method was most convenient to be used. Just to make a small historical recap on profit split, it was a method that at the beginning wasn't even included within the transfer pricing guidelines because it wasn't seen with good eyes. We couldn't really understand whether if it was really within the arm's length principle or not. That idea changed over the time and we finally included. And now it is at the center stage of the debate. Everybody wants to apply profit split because of the two-sided nature, because we do believe that maybe if we haven't been able to produce a decent result within the arm's length principle with the other methods, maybe the profit split will be the answer to our prayers. So we produced this guidance to see whether we should, whether there were new things or things that we hadn't really discussed or think about within the profit split. And we came up with a guidance that concludes that this is the method that you should use whenever you have unique and valuable contributions, that it's a method that you should use if you have a shared assumption of risk, and also an important part of this revised text in profit split, which currently, I think the current version of the TP guidelines still has this text in gray. Well, now you can enter the link and you will have the new wording. It was also to revise the profit splitting factors. There was a lot of discussion around the countries to come up with profit splitting factors. We ended up, I think, with the usual suspects. I don't think that there's any single profit splitting factors currently included within this guidance that we hadn't applied before. Just to give you a little bit of insights of how things evolve within the discussion at the WP6. For example, one idea was whether the payroll of the important people within the company should be taken into account for splitting the profits. But of course, then you have countries like emerging countries that would say that cannot be a profit splitting factor because for sure I'm going to lose. So all these things are carefully discussed. You have many visions now with the inclusive framework. You have developed countries, you have developing countries, you have emerging economies, you have BRICS, and they all have different approaches to this. So what we ended up was saying that, well, the usual profit splitting factors are assets, capital, costs, expenses, headcount, time spent, a number of servers, for example, data storage, floor area. So as you all know, these are the main splitting factors that we've always used. An important thing here is that this has to be done on objective data, and that, of course, they need to be closely linked to the revenue, the profit generator of the transaction. Okay. Now, moving on to hard-to-value intangibles. That was also a complicated topic. First of all, because it's a measure that is addressed for the tax administrations. We had some discussions on whether, when we did the public consultation, some companies asked, oh, so can I now apply it to my own benefit if I transferred an intangible 10 years ago and it turned out that maybe it didn't turn out that well, or on the contrary, it turned out like really well, and may I now revise the price that I set up 10 years ago? And we said, no, no, no. This is only, unfortunately, for tax administration. It's a tool that will enable them to use ex post information to have a presumptive evidence that maybe the transfer price that was set up when the intangible was transferred may not be in accordance with the arm's length principle. The discussion was very complicated also because of the nature of this approach, in which tax authorities can look back 10 years, 20 years ago to see whether this was done correctly. And as you all know, which in the end we figured out, well, this is not actually per se a problem on the hard-to-value intangibles. We can deal with it every day. And it's the fact that you have jurisdictions with different types, with different statutes of limitations. You may have countries that have 10 years. You may have other countries that only have 3 years. So of course, if you ever come up with a result that an adjustment is needed, maybe by the time you are requesting this adjustment, maybe in the other jurisdiction, it's already a close year. So it's an important issue. And that is something that currently WP1, which is the tax treaties unit, is working on, because, as I said, it's not per se an HTVI problem, because we can see it all the time. If you have different statutes of limitation, you can ask for a corresponding adjustment, and maybe on the other jurisdiction, it's already elapsed. So it's an important thing that we carefully try to address within this application guidance. And it's also a document that will say that jurisdictions have to make sure that whenever they are dealing with a hard-to-value intangible, they need to act as soon as possible, precisely in order to avoid these differences in the statute of limitation, and that they should also prevent any double taxation. In order to publish this application guidance that some countries didn't want it in the TP guidelines, some countries wanted it out, some countries wanted it in, we finally agreed that it should be part of the transfer pricing guidelines, and it will become an annex to Chapter 6. But in order to do that, the countries that didn't really want it to be there, because they said, well, you're actually going to tell the countries to enlarge their statute of limitations in order to be able to get hold of these hard-to-value intangibles. And we said, no, it's not the purpose. Every jurisdiction has the ability to decide whether they want to have a different statute of limitations for certain transactions, and for the ones that the law doesn't allow it, well, maybe they will have to decide whether they expand it or not, or if there's any other way that they can do it. So what we said is that, okay, let's keep it as it is, and what we will do now is to have some monitoring process to see exactly which countries have already applied the HTVI guidance within their local rules, which won't, which will decide to expand their statute of limitations, so that the other countries sitting at the table are aware of what's happening with their counterparties, and if ever, if this really comes as a big bet, decide whether maybe within the tax treaty they should address this issue and maybe put limits, clearly put in limits to the fact that corresponding adjustments will be provided even though maybe the statute of limitation has elapsed or whatever reason. So it's an interesting project because we ended up working closely with WP1 because everything is interconnected, right? Okay, now let's go to financial transactions. This was a mandate from BEPS Action 4 and Action 9. There's a long history of this project way before this. This is just to tell you, this is the third time that WP6 has tried to come up with guidance on financial transactions. So as it is the third time, we will succeed. The prior two weren't really, but they got really close. But in the end, and you can imagine that it is complicated because we've never had guidance on financial transactions. So we use the bits of the TP guidelines here and there, and countries have produced their own approach to deal with this type of transactions. And as it's been so long, countries have either implemented a variety of approaches which can go from safe harbors, just to make it easy and plain and simple, or they have produced domestic regulations to address financial transactions, or they're just using as I said, just bits here and there of the TP guidelines, the principles, to come up with a reasonable solution from their own perspective. So of course, if you ask these countries to now sit down and produce a consensus document that they will all apply, it's a difficult task. And also because of the nature of the transactions that are embedded within the financial world, it's not as simple as a simple sale of assets or even a transfer of an intangible. You have to make sure that you are covering all the aspects and that in every single part of the road, you are abiding by the arm's length principle. So this is, we produced a discussion draft that I hope you have commented on. It's important, the public consultation, because even though you may feel a little bit frustrated because you've put a lot of effort, you've analyzed the issues, you're trying to come up with solutions, and in the end, we read them, because we read them all, we read the 1,000 pages that arrived, and you have to decide, right, which ones will be more likely than not accepted by the WP6, and which ones, even though they may sound very useful and very interesting, it's going to be complicated because of the positions of the countries. So thank you for commenting on all of our discussion drafts. But it's true that it's hard to make sure that everybody is happy with those inclusions. So after we came up with the discussion draft, in order to bridge the gap between with the opposing views of certain countries, we did some focus groups in order to address specific topics. Otherwise, you start talking about one topic and then another and another, and then this never ends. So we try to produce very issue notes that would address specific questions. So finally, the good news is that we just finished WP6 this week. It took a week and a half to go through the new discussion draft on financial transactions. And I have to say that we are very happy of the progress that we've made. Almost 80% of the discussion draft is being approved. Of course, there's some redrafting work that needs to be done, because I don't know if you've ever tried to come up with a single text with 50 people commenting on, I want a shall, I want a can, remove this sentence, I want this. You end up with a Frankenstein. So you need to reread the whole thing and make sure that it makes sense, right, from head to toes. So as I said, 80% of the discussion draft is approved. But still, there are some issues that remain within the agenda that we need to figure out how we are going to address and how countries will agree. These are not just minor things. Maybe if they were, you would just think, well, let's just not put it in the discussion draft and produce something as we are mandated to do in 2019. These topics are, for example, whether we should use or not the group credit rating. So it's not a small issue. It wasn't the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue from the discussion draft was whether the arm's length principle should also apply to the capital structure of a company. And believe it or not, we were able to bridge that gap. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a text that countries can live with. So we're very happy of that. But there's still, for example, this group credit rating. There's also some issues on warranties, and also maybe something on simplification measures, safe harbors. So these are topics that will need to be addressed in the future months. It needs to be done quickly because I don't know if you're aware, but there's going to be an inclusive framework meeting in January, and the digital task force which is happening next week at the OECD, will then decide what is the next step for the digital work after we produce the interim report. And it is more likely than not, a lot of the work will end up in transfer pricing because of these ideas of resolving the digital within an allocation of profits. So we need to work on financial transactions quickly before this gets into our basket. Otherwise, it will be really a pity not to produce something. I think it's been long awaited, and we're really close to achieve that goal. Okay, so we also have another work coming. So this is pretty much almost over. We are also planning on revising Chapter 4. We've also produced, let's say, scoping papers. It wasn't the scoping paper that we put up for public consultation. It was just a few questions that we needed to get input from to decide what was the main problems that companies were facing and which topics should be addressed within this scoping paper. This scoping paper has been agreed in this WP6 meeting, so we only need to make sure that we have enough resources to produce this work in the coming years. There aren't that many changes that need to be addressed, but definitely to focus on APAs, on dispute resolution, and of course on risk assessment. We believe that those are the areas that need to be reinforced and to work on a little bit more, because they were written a long time ago and we need to come up with a revised guidance. Another project that is also happening is the guidance on intragroup services, Chapter 7. Under the actions 8 to 10, we only included this low value-added intragroup service approach. But the chapter per se wasn't really revised, except for certain tweaks here and there. So we are actually trying to come up with a work stream that shouldn't take long, because we're not really thinking on doing a lot more, but just to make sure that it is consistent with the other parts of the transfer pricing guidelines, maybe a little bit also on the benefit test and how it is interconnected or not with the accurate delineation of the transaction. Or also, let me think, what is the other thing? The benefit test, and also, for example, the transfer pricing methodology that should apply. Right? We only have a few methods that are currently stated within the guidance, but we believe that the others should also be included. So again, this has been discussed, it's been approved, so we only need to organize ourselves to see exactly how this is going, when is it going to happen. On other projects, as I briefly told you at the beginning of the presentation, we got this mandate. I don't know if you're aware, but in 2016, the IMF and the OECD produced a document that's called Tax Certainty. And this was done based on two surveys, one that was addressed for the tax authorities and another survey addressed to the companies, in order to make sure that we knew where were the areas where tax uncertainty arose. And based on that, the G20 made a recommendation to all the working parties to make sure that within their work streams, they should be addressing this topic, because it's not a minor topic, right? It harms either the tax administration or the companies, and we need to make sure that we bridge that gap. So we started this project in 2017. We started with a brainstorm within WP6, which were the areas where delegates thought that we should work on tax certainty. Now we have a more concrete project, and it will start, for example, if it is approved, because it's still not approved, but it's under discussion. But our proposal from the Secretariat was to begin with, for example, an update of the simplification measures survey that was done back in 2012. So we need to make sure, we need to see if countries have adopted or not more simplification measures, how they are, to whom they're addressed, to to decide whether we should produce more simplification measures. And I know that this comes a little bit as a surprise because you will say, you just produced a document that is so complicated, and why bother now trying to come up with simplification measures? Well, yes, we want to, just keep on working. The agenda never ends. So it's going to be simplification measures, but also an important part is that we will also address these questionnaires to you. Because as I said, we need to have both sides of the story. So if it's approved, there's going to be questionnaires that are going to be made public for you to contribute, and we can then take stock on which will be the specific actions that we will take towards tax certainty, which could be simplification measures, whether it could be, I don't know, let's just shoot to the moon. The transfer pricing guidelines aren't that complete, or they're ambiguous, or so. Let's see what happened in that regards. And finally, the transfer pricing work program that we currently have with Brazil, as I said, it started with the letter that was sent by the former Brazilian president to the Secretary General asking for Brazil to be considered a future member of the OECD. Because of that, I don't know if you're aware, but if you want to enter the OECD, the Council first needs to decide, right, if the table should be made longer or not, how many more countries should be included. The last country that was accepted was Lithuania, but in the pipeline, Costa Rica should also be part of the OECD, Colombia. Russia started a few years ago, but it's on standby mode. And so on Brazil, it's okay, so we're keeping this becoming a larger and larger table, or what? So it's a strategic decision. The Council needs to decide how many more countries should be included and which countries should be included, because there are also other countries that have already expressed their intention to become members. So that decision hasn't taken place. But whenever we know that there's a country who wants in, we need to start doing like a checklist, right? Does this country is more likely than not able to become a member? And for that matter, there are many principles within the OECD that need to be, that the countries need to adhere to. A funny thing is that Brazil adheres with most of them already. It's included in many work streams and is abiding by many of the OECD recommendations. But the showstopper is transfer pricing. That's the truth. It's transfer pricing, their big issue. So we went on a field trip to Brazil, I think it was 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. We met with the person at Receita Federal, and Pascal Saint-Amand told him the bare truth. If you don't do something on transfer pricing, this will not happen, because it's a main principle to adhere to the arm's length. So we're working with them, we're producing some interesting technical work, but the good part is that Receita has changed a lot her mind. At the beginning, they were very reluctant because they thought the rules were working, and it's true, for their own purpose, they work. And they do apply the arm's length standard, but within Brazil. They don't really care about what's happening on the other side. And definitely double taxation is a main issue. So we're working on that. This work program should be finalized next year. And this would be regardless of whether they get an acceptance letter to start the accession process or not. And finally, we also have, as we speak, there's a discussion that's taking place in Paris at the OECD on the 2020 review of the CBCR report. We decided to hold a joint session between WP6 and WP10 to start working on the agenda, which will be the topics that will be covered under this 2020 review. The topics were divided by either they were a matter of scope, of content, of surrogate parent entity filing, or local filing, on the exchange of CBCR and any other things. And in other, it's not mentioned here, but it's, for example, whether the master file should become a minimum standard. These ideas or issues were taken from the Secretariat, from public consultations, from any conference that we've attended, and maybe we'd have taxpayers addressing us some of their concerns. So we put together that list, and delegates are currently discussing which of these topics have relevance, which ones will be addressed within the 2020 reviews, which topics will be completely deleted from the list because they don't see the benefit, or they have such strong country positions that they know they won't be able to come up with a single approach. Okay, so this is what we've been working on. I thank you all for your patience, and I don't know if you have any questions, or Jimmy, tell me what. Yeah, no, thank you. If you would be so kind to take some questions. Yes, yes, sure. Or later on, I mean, I'm going to be around.
No, well, in advance of your presentation, we talked a little bit about the hard to value intangibles, and for me, it looks like a problem that can't be solved because it's either digital or bricks and mortar. And could you shed some light on how you think it will be solved? How can we apply? Well, we for sure cannot apply the former bricks and mortar criteria on hard valuable intangibles. The other way around is extremely complicated as well.
Yes. I know that this new section D3 and Chapter 6 is a complicated section because it entails a lot of work from the taxpayer's perspective. And the truth is that I think that maybe we're asking, it's the Santa Claus letter. We want it all. We want to make sure that you've covered all the business aspects, the possible developments, that you came up with a reasonable weighting of those developments. And the truth is that, as Jimmy mentioned, I used to work for the Big Four, and I've been involved with a lot of clients. And I know that sometimes even tax administrations complain, yes, there's an information asymmetry issues here, yes, but sometimes even for companies, I know that it's hard because you cannot possibly consider like all the scenarios and what if this becomes a blockbuster, what if it totally fails, right? The prior day of the launching of the product. So it is complicated, as you say, Jimmy, because we're asking a lot. But the position of the countries is that whenever you're doing a hard-to-value intangible transaction, that you should be able to consider as much information as it is available at the time of that transaction. That, of course, and maybe I don't know how many of you are involved or deal with valuation techniques. It's also not a science that will come up with a single result, right? Depending on how you tweak it here and there, it can lead to very different results. So you have to make sure that you are applying correctly the principles. And just to make sure and put yourself on what would a third party think of this. Would they actually be covering all of these aspects, or am I missing out on something? So it's true that it is complicated. We'll see what happens. Not many countries have said that they will apply it. We know for sure that one is already applying it, but we have to see what comes out of this. Of course, there were some ideas when we did the public consultation from the business community saying, oh, well, maybe you should inform, right, the tax administration that, okay, I'm doing this, and maybe revise it and tell me whether you think this is appropriate or not, so that 20 years later, you don't come back and tell me, oh, guess what? I think that this was not at arm's length, and I need to revise it, and then. But we've tried to put some limits to this so that it's not precisely leaving it to the tax administration to come up with tax adjustments based on the mere fact that maybe the revenue stream of that intangible don't seem to be in accordance to what they first thought, the 20% threshold and so on. So I know it is complicated, but we'll see exactly how it will turn out. I may not really have answered your question, but it's true that you have to consider a lot of factors, and you have to make sure what a third party would have done. Would have they considered all of these? Am I missing out on something? And hope for the best that it will be correctly priced.
And within the EU, there's now also mandatory disclosure, which also obligates you to list all your business restructurings. No, I was. No, I'm not sure whether everybody heard, but I was saying for the EU countries, we now also have mandatory disclosure in a couple of years, and that obligates you to report your business restructurings to the tax authorities, basically.
Any other questions from the audience? It's always the mic, because it's frightening people.
Or you can sing a song, or tell us a joke, right? I mean, I know it's early, but come on, don't be shy. Ask me.
I have a quick question relating to the financial transactions. I know it's a difficult subject. We all probably know that, but is there a timeline for the next draft after the working party concluded their works?
Yes, we're supposed to finalize it by 2019. That's the deadline. So hopefully we will get through these pending issues in the next months, because then you have to send it to the CFA inclusive framework. They have to approve it, and only then it can be published. I think it would be very complicated not to publish anything, because what will actually happen is that you all will only have the discussion draft, and you may only take ideas from there, and it's actually changed. So I think we are really forced to just come up with a final text. Otherwise, whenever you will have a situation, you will go to the tax authorities and say, but the discussion draft, which is the only document that's been out, says this and this. Yes, but at the end, we didn't agree on that. So it's going to be complicated, but we should do that, 2019.
Hi, I work for a multinational company, and we have a really small tax team. And only this month we filed our first country-by-country report, and we've just filed, within deadline, we filed our first master files. And as a, really, I'd say a non-tax specialist, I have just been absolutely thrown by Australia wants something different, Japan wants something different, China, isn't this all about having one file? So I was curious when you said at the very end,
Totally.
2020 review, country-by-country reporting and master file. What is the thinking? Are you going to make it easier? No. Actually, when the 2020 report came out, it was a difficult report because countries had their own views on what should be included. And let's remember that this is not a tool for tax administrations to just come up with an adjustment. It's only a tool for risk assessment. So it's like at the very beginning of their process. And to make sure that everybody was happy with the content of it, and you can see, I think it's in the preface of the document of Action 13, there's even a sentence that says that, well, several countries wanted to have more detailed information, but for the time being, we won't do it because it shouldn't be used as a way to just come up with direct adjustments. So yes, what we will be discussing is whether the current content, it's not revised all the sections of the CBC. It's just the sections that we've been aware that maybe they're not that clear, that maybe, for example, one of the topics was, what about joint ventures, right? You're a multinational group, but for a specific reason you have within a business line or a joint venture with an independent party. Should it be included or not? So tax administrations have their own views on should we actually expand that or not. So those are the topics that will be covered next year that they're discussing today, which topics will still be on the agenda for next year, that when the 2020 review will start or not. And it's true what you say, the country-by-country report, that should be a single report. There's no way countries can ask for more information or for different information, because also for that matter, we have the peer review process, where countries revise themselves and say, oh, I don't know, France, okay, it's abiding by the rules. Oh, maybe China wanted something. So that's very strict. Country by country should be one size only. But it's true that the master file, it's more complicated because it's not a minimum standard. We've only put up certain topics that should be included, but it's not a complete list or a definitive list. And the idea was that it was produced by the headquarters and then send it out to all the remaining subsidiaries where they need it. And it's true that we got the message from the business community, hey, this country is asking this, but this country is also asking this. And so I cannot just produce a single master file. I have to produce sometimes as many master files as subsidiaries I have, because I have to make sure that I comply with each one of the rules. So that's why this topic is very important for WP6, because, I mean, I'm not going to talk on behalf of WP6 or any, but as a transfer pricing person, I think it makes sense. Although it's true that then jurisdictions are completely free to ask whatever they want, and they can call it something else. So that's something that it's difficult, because the OECD is only there to produce international standards, best practices, but we're not the policemen. We cannot tell them, oh, you've done this, it's bad, unless it becomes a minimum standard, and then you can have peer reviews, but still, as I said, tax jurisdictions are free to ask other types of information like this EU report or transfer pricing returns or questionnaires. That's difficult. And it's true, now the tax burden is really high.
And if I may add to that, because I work for the Dutch Tax Administration, there's also a public discussion draft on the 2020 review, which is scheduled for 2019. So you will have an opportunity to comment there as well.
For sure.
Liam, you had a final, there's a mic.
Yeah.
On my colleague's question on financial transactions. You can probably respond with yes or no. Is the consensus feature of the draft going to be kept for the 2019?
No. It should be a consensus document. Otherwise, it's not published. Okay. It has to be. It was a difficult battle, but we convinced the countries that didn't want certain features of the discussion draft as it is now to be sent out to the public, because we thought, maybe the ideas from the public will help us resolve these issues. But it was only because of that the discussion draft was sent out with this disclosure. No, if we do commit to publish something, it is on a consensus basis, because it will be Chapter 10. That's it. And we're not as the model tax convention, where countries can set up their positions. Oh, here, this yes, this no, this maybe. It's either it's all or nothing. With, of course, the fact that then you have to do the interpretation of the guidance, and that it's just open for everyone.
Well, thank you, Marlen, for this great presentation and for taking some questions. I hope you stay on for a bit.